We are on the brink of uncovering a hidden world. A world that connects past and future generations in ways we never imagined possible.
We're all familiar with the idea of inheritance and DNA. We're all familiar with the idea that the environment affects the development of the child. What we now realise is that these two are much more intertwined than we've known before, that the environment actually affects the DNA. And this is the new exciting science of epigenetics.
The mice are agouti mice. One is kind of really much bigger and yellow, and the other one's much smaller and brown. Neither have a disease. They're the same species, but obviously they look really different. They've got the same DNA. They are genetically identical, so there's no reason genetically why they should have these differences.
Well, what we now realise is that changes to the DNA are possible, so-called epigenetic changes. That means on top of genetics.
The DNA has the instructions for how we function and how we're going to develop, but the epigenetics will change whether or not it's read and how it's read. So typically when we think of DNA, we think of a double helix, but actually DNA is tightly coiled around proteins called histones, and depending on the spacing between these histone proteins, that will determine whether or not the machinery that's going to read the DNA is able to access it. So obviously if you've got really nice spacing, the DNA in between the histones is able to be read. But if it's bunched together, you just can't get at it, and there's no way that the machinery can read the DNA and interpret the instructions that it contains.
And what happens is that new chemical groups are added to the DNA, and these control whether the gene is turned on or off, or if it's turned on, how much it's turned on.
The methyl group sits on the DNA and essentially blocks it from being read so that the gene is inactive. The only difference is what their mothers ate during pregnancy. If you feed the pregnant mother mouse a normal diet, then the gene which is responsible for the yellow coat colour, that's still switched on and being read. But if you feed the pregnant mother mouse a diet rich in supplements, which have lots of methyl donors, which block this gene from being read, that means that it has the brown colour and it's much leaner and it's less likely to suffer from things like diabetes, obesity and cancer.
Epigenetics is still quite a young science, and there's a lot we don't understand about it. But we do understand that these marks to the DNA can last right through a person's lifetime. It's not nature or nurture, it's nurture affecting nature in a way that we're starting to understand at the molecular level.
One day, our ancestor, Homo erectus, discovered fire.
Huh? Well, what do you know? Fire!
Ingeniously, he used it for light. For heat. And for barbecue chicken.
Yum!
The news spread quickly. Soon we were baking clay, smelting ore. Humankind had fearlessly embarked on the road to progress. Today, thanks to human ingenuity, over 100,000 new chemicals synthesized in laboratories fashion the world we live in. We've introduced these amazing molecules into our environment without really considering whether nature would be able to recognize them and break them down. In our short-sighted rush to progress, we never imagined that some of these molecules would one day work their way into living organisms.
No thought was really given to the health effects, maybe even outside acute effects on workers. I mean, if something was killing someone in a factory, you might slow down the production of it. But once it was out into the environment, there were no laws, there were no regulations, there were no thresholds, and that is largely true today. I mean, one of our toughest talking points, both with reporters and with regular people, they just can't believe these chemicals aren't regulated, but they're not.
A lot of these chemicals are post-war creations, so they entered commerce in the aftermath of World War II, at a time when safety testing requirements just didn't really exist. So these chemicals have been in consumer products for decades, and a lot of them are hormone-disrupting chemicals. Once they're in our bodies, they mimic estrogen or testosterone, and they trigger all of the biological processes that hormones trigger.
We have found over 200 toxic chemicals in the umbilical cord blood of babies. So you're polluted before you're born. Some of those chemicals were banned 30 years ago, and they're still showing up in newborns today. So we have this incredibly disturbing legacy of pollutants that stick around for a long time. They're toxic. They get into our blood. And on top of that, we have a flood of new chemicals and uses of those chemicals in consumer products day in and day out that we're exposed to.
All around us are the products of modern chemistry. All are made of or covered with something that came out of a test tube.
For instance, if you wanted to go to a chemist and say, look, I want to have a chemical, say a pesticide, which will persist throughout the food chain, and I don't want it to have to renew it very, very often. I'd like it to be relatively non-destructible. And then he'd put two benzene molecules on the blackboard and add a chlorine here and a chlorine that, and that was DDT.
When the 8th Army needed Jap civilians to help them out in our occupation, they called on native doctors to administer DDT under the supervision of our men to stem a potential typhus epidemic. Dusting like this goes a long way in checking disease, and the laughs are them. Pardon our dust.
As the petrochemical era grew and grew, warning signs emerged that some of these chemicals could pose hazards. The data initially were trivial, anecdotal, but gradually a body of data started accumulating to the extent that we now know that the synthetic chemicals which have permeated our workplace, our consumer products, our air, our water, produce cancer and also birth defects and some other toxic effects. furthermore, industry has known about this, at least most industries have known about this, and have attempted to trivialize these risks. We are now in the midst of a major cancer epidemic, and I have no doubt, and I have documented the basis for this, that industry is largely responsible for this overwhelming epidemic of cancer, in which 1 in every 2 men get cancer in their lifetimes, and 1 in every 3 women get cancer in their lifetimes.
Well, somehow we have industrial chemicals floating around in our bodies. You'd think one of those would be enough, but 232, it's kind of hard to say what's going on.
I don't want to take the chance of buying something that could be really bad for my family.
Well, that's the gang. Chances are you bought them already.
I'd struggled with fertility and repeated miscarriages. And as I searched for an answer to why I was having such a hard time carrying a baby to term, I discovered the connection between our environment, our toxic exposures, and our health, particularly our reproductive health.
What we don't know can really hurt us, and there's a lot that we don't know.
80% of the common chemicals in everyday use in this country we know almost nothing about.
From our own studies, we've tested 200 people, we found 482 chemicals, and there are 15,000 chemicals out there in heavy use. How many are showing up in our blood? How many of them might pose a risk?
We have no idea what the long-term health implications of these results are. And I do not want my son or anyone's children to be our scientific experiment.
The American people expect that all chemicals used in the American economy are safe. But, Mr. Chairman, the 30-year-old law that gives EPA that authority is outdated.
Chemicals are part of our daily lives. They are everywhere. In our personal care products, cosmetics, toys, cars, furniture, food packages, IT equipment, electrical appliances, everywhere. Consumers strongly believe that chemicals that are on the market have been tested and are safe, but this is far from being true, and a huge majority of chemicals that are on the market have never undergone any risk assessment. Some of them may cause allergies, or cancer, or obesity, or disrupt your hormonal system. Now, this is a problem for all consumers, but this is especially a problem for elderly people, for young children, for babies, and for pregnant women. And studies have shown that there are already hundreds of chemicals in the blood of newborn babies. We have particular concerns with endocrine disruptors. Those are chemicals that disrupt your hormonal system and can lead to problems of fertility, to cancers, early puberty, and obesity. Now, those substances can be really harmful, and they can have long-term effects even at a low dose.
There are hundreds of chemicals in the environment that are coming from products that we are using every day, and these chemicals were declared safe dozens of years ago, and now we understand that they can disrupt the endocrine system, the controlling system of our bodies.
Well, our hormone systems are very complex, and everybody must understand it goes beyond the usual sex hormones. There are a lot of hormones. Insulin is a hormone. I don't think most people understand that. And we have an epidemic of diabetes and obesity, all connected, in the northern hemisphere, that now, basically, some of the most recent studies, and even a human study, showed a link between a very commonly used plastic called bisphenol A and diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular problems.
What we used to think was that we could use high-dose testing to predict what's going to happen at low levels. That's how all regulatory toxicology works. We used to think that that was sufficient. But that was before we began to realize that some contaminants, like bisphenol A, behave like hormones. And the people that study hormones, endocrinologists, have known for years that what happens at high doses isn't necessarily the same as what happens at low doses. So all of a sudden, as toxicology is confronted with this new way of looking at chemical action, they have to throw out one of their most basic assumptions, that the dose makes the poison.
The numbers are so small that they're beyond the comprehension of most people. That's how small they are. So you think of a part per thousand, a part per million, a part per billion, a part per trillion. A natural hormone, below a part per trillion, it can stimulate breast cancer cells to grow. And now we are seeing chemicals like bisphenol A that are what hard, clear plastic is made out of, and the lining of cans is made out of. It can stimulate breast cancer cells at below a part per trillion, just like the natural hormone. The easiest concept for people to remember is that this hand and the fin of a dolphin and the wing of a bat, at the early embryo stage, they look identical. And inside of the wing of a bat and inside of the fin of the dolphin is a hand. So at the beginning of development of a fish or a frog or a mouse or a human, the early stages of development that are disrupted by endocrine disruptors and the genetic mechanisms are almost identical. We end up looking different, but don't let that deceive you. The mechanisms of development are very, very similar, and the disruption events of development lead to diseases in all of these species. We have proven that in animals, if you expose during the time that you start out, your body starts out as one single cell and then becomes 2 cells and 4 cells and many cells. And we know that as one cell is becoming many other cells, the hormones that control that, if you disrupt them, then you permanently alter the genes in the new cells. And when you do that at the beginning of life, those cells and all of the cells that come from them are defective. And the consequence is that, for instance, after puberty, when the reproductive system starts forming, abnormalities in the organs that after puberty begin to develop, like the female uterus, suddenly you start to see diseases of that organ. You don't see the disease in a child because the uterus is not functioning yet.
So not just one system. This could be the development of the brain, which basically the brain at that time is getting programmed for how an individual is going to develop later in life as well. So their behavior is being affected. Intelligence could be affected.
My involvement in the whole pesticide issue was sort of a surprise as well when I was approached by the largest chemical company in the world, and they asked me if I would evaluate how atrazine affected amphibians or my frogs. Turns out atrazine is the largest selling product for the largest chemical company in the world. It's the #1 contaminant of groundwater, drinking water, rainwater. In 2003, after my studies, it was banned in the European Union, but in that same year, the United States EPA re-registered the compound. We were a bit surprised when we found out that when we exposed frogs to very low levels of atrazine, 0.1 parts per billion, that it produced animals that look like this. These are the dissected gonads of an animal that has 2 testes, 2 ovaries, another large testis, more ovaries, which is not normal, even for amphibians. In some cases, in other species like the North American leopard frog, we showed that males exposed to atrazine grew eggs in their testes, and you can see these large yolked up eggs bursting through the surface of this male's testis. What we proposed and what we've now generated support for is that what atrazine is doing is wreaking havoc, causing a hormone imbalance. Normally the testis should make testosterone, the male hormone, but what atrazine does is it turns on an enzyme, the machinery, if you will, aromatase, that converts testosterone into estrogen. And as a result, these exposed males lose their testosterone, they're chemically castrated, and they're subsequently feminized because now they're making the female hormone. Now this is what brought me to the human-related issues, because it turns out that the #1 cancer in women, breast cancer, is regulated by estrogen and by this enzyme aromatase. So when you develop a cancerous cell in your breast, aromatase converts androgens into estrogens, and that estrogen turns on or promotes the growth of that cancer so that it turns into a tumor and spreads. In fact, this aromatase is so important in breast cancer that the latest treatment for breast cancer is a chemical called letrozole, which blocks aromatase, blocks estrogen, so that if you develop the mutated cell, it doesn't grow into a tumor. Now, what's interesting is, of course, that we're still using 80 million pounds of atrazine, the #1 contaminant in drinking water, that does the opposite, turns on aromatase, increases estrogen, and promotes tumors in rats, and is associated with tumors, breast cancer in humans. What's interesting is, in fact, the same company that sold us 80 million pounds of atrazine, the breast cancer promoter, now sells us the blocker, the exact same company. And so I find it interesting that instead of treating this disease by preventing exposure to the chemicals that promote it, we simply respond by putting more chemicals into the environment.
Our modern environment now includes over 80,000 synthetic chemicals, with around 1,000 new ones being created every year. More than 500 of these are known to cause cancer or to disrupt the hormones in the body. Of the substances that are strongly linked to breast cancer, many are chemically similar to estrogen. Estrogen is a natural hormone that promotes female characteristics, and our cells recognise it by its phenyl ring. However, many synthetic chemicals also hold these phenyl rings. This can cause them to have estrogen mimicking effects. These estrogen mimics can cause problems by taking the place of natural estrogen and turning effects on or off in the cells at the wrong times. Because of this hormone disrupting effect, the estrogen mimics are classed as endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. Importantly, these chemicals aren't only found in factories or behind laboratory doors, as they are all around us in our environment and everyday products. You can find EDCs in many toiletries, detergents, plastic containers, and many other sources.
I tell my college students, because I'm a professor, that the men in this class probably have half the amount of sperm in their testes than I do. Can you imagine? I am 3 times their age, and I am more than twice the man they are.
New science is raising some scary questions. Is fertility declining, especially among men? Back in the 1990s, a controversial Danish study painted a dire picture that suggested sperm counts were falling at such a rapid rate that there would be almost no sperm left in 50 years.
Is there really this 50% decline in 50 years in male sperm counts? Big deal. So I was skeptical,
Skeptical, but still intrigued, Swan decided to do her own test. She came up with the same results as the Danish researchers. Then she looked at the sperm counts of men in Missouri, New York, Minnesota, and California.
The men in central Missouri had about half as many moving sperm.
Swan had a theory about what was going on. Could it be chemicals in the environment?
There are 80,000 chemicals in commerce, and most of them have not been tested. There's no question that pesticides can reduce sperm count. The question is, how much do you need to do the damage?
Last year, Swan looked at another population, university and college-aged males in Rochester, New York. Men just like these swimmers, considered to be at their physical peak, their prime of life.
And what did you find? First of all, that their sperm quality was not great. 23% of the men had counts, which would be grounds for seeing an infertility doctor.
But some scientists say we're worrying about the wrong thing. Perhaps it's not the quantity of sperm that counts.
What you do have to worry about is the quality of the sperm.
Dr. Keith Jarvie says it can be a game of chance.
I mean, I have guys coming in with 2 or 3 million sperm. They have kids. Someone who looks very similar, sitting opposite me with 20 or 25 million sperm, having difficulty having children. So there's something about the sperm that we can't necessarily measure. It's basically Las Vegas. If you have more sperm, you're more likely to roll good dice.
When a man orgasms during sex, millions of microscopic tadpole-like organisms swim for their lives, with one goal in mind, to fertilize a waiting egg. But only the strongest swimmer will make it to its destination.
Semen concentrations declined 32% from an average of 73.6 million per milliliter in 1989 to 49.9 million per milliliter in 2005, lower than the World Health Organization's suggested threshold of 55 million. Research has suggested endocrine disruptors may be behind the decline, as they affect the body's hormonal system by mimicking or blocking normal hormones in the body.
Sometimes there may not be any sperm in the ejaculate, or the sperm may not be swimming in a straight line. That's called a motility problem. Other times their shape just isn't right. That's a morphology problem. Then there's the biological clock. Men have one too. It just ticks a little differently. As women age, their supply of eggs dwindles drastically. In men, the sperm is still there, but the quality changes. They don't move as fast, they're the wrong shape, and more of the DNA is damaged.
There has been studies showing that when the father is older and the mother is young, the incidence of autism and the incidence of schizophrenia is higher. Some studies are only 1.5 times higher, other studies are up to 4 or 5 times higher.
But regardless of the potential risks, medical science has turned its attention to solving the problem of the endangered male.
One thing that we do know for certain is that there are certain forms of male infertility that by their very presence we know that they will be transmitted to the offspring.
It's long been known cancer can rob a man of his fertility. But what if you flip that equation? What if infertility was a sign, a marker that a man might be more likely to develop cancer? New research suggests infertility may only be the first health battle men will fight.
We can say with absolute certainty that amongst the risk factors that we count for testis cancer, infertility is absolutely one of them.
How high of a risk? 3-fold. Dr. Thomas Walsh has published studies on the possible links between infertility and cancer. And testis cancer wasn't the only risk, according to a 2010 study.
Specifically, those men who were infertile and had abnormal semen quality were about 2.5 times more likely to develop high-grade, so clinically significant prostate cancer, and that their infertility was preceding their development of prostate cancer by 5 to 10 years.
Not only does infertility appear to increase the risk of prostate cancer, but the kind that could be deadly. It's another level at which doctors are just beginning to understand infertility and its potential consequences.
Many chemicals that have been designed and used over the years have ended up in places where they weren't expected. They've ended up in breast milk, they've ended up in children's umbilical cord blood, they've ended up in wildlife. They weren't expected to be there. When that happens, that means that chemical is behaving in ways that wasn't anticipated, and we should at that point reverse course rather than continuing to plow ahead, waiting for evidence of proof of harm before we decide to change course.
I see this as a kind of massive experiment that we're all part of. Through chemistry, you don't just get better living, you get serious adverse health effects. Chemicals can go into commerce, assumed to be safe. And there are about 80,000 chemicals in commerce. Very, very few of them have been tested, and almost none of them have been banned.
What's showing up in household dust is also showing up in our bodies. Toxic chemicals are absorbed through our skin, breathed into our lungs, and digested through our water and food. Groundbreaking tests have found the same chemicals in people's blood, hair, and urine.
The endocrine system is important for human and animal health because it regulates and controls hormones and important functions like metabolism, growth, development, sleep, and mood. And this importance increases at critical life stages such as infancy and childhood.
Some chemicals might be harmful if our bodies are overexposed to them. So how do we know when we are overexposed to them? The first step is to establish the amount or the dose of a chemical required for the body to respond and produce an effect, and to determine how much is acceptable or tolerable for the body. There is a famous quote by Paracelsus, a 16th century Swiss scientist, that says, all substances are poisons. It's the dose that makes the poison. This means that the higher the dose of a chemical, the greater the response and the effect, and as a consequence, the likelihood of an adverse effect. It also means that for most chemicals, there is a threshold dose below which there is no adverse effect. Based on the threshold, we can establish safe levels for substances such as food additives, flavorings, pesticides, and so on. However, some substances, known as endocrine active substances, that behave similarly to human hormones, may cause adverse effects at low doses, but not necessarily at all higher doses. These chemicals have different kinds of dose-response curves. For instance, this U-shaped curve with high response, both at the low and high dose range, but not at the intermediate dose range. It would be impossible to calculate a threshold and consequently to establish a safe level for these chemicals.
They're substances that interact with or interfere with hormones in the endocrine system. When this leads to adverse effects, they're called endocrine disruptors. Humans and animals may be exposed to a wide range of endocrine active substances. These can be naturally occurring, such as phytoestrogens in soya, or synthetic, like dioxins and some pesticides. We endorse the World Health Organization definition that an endocrine disruptor is defined by 3 criteria: the presence of an adverse effect, the presence of endocrine activity, and a causal relationship between the two. In other words, that the endocrine activity leads to an adverse effect. Not all scientists and regulators agree on a distinction between endocrine active substances and endocrine disruptors, but we believe that this is important.
So what we are confronting here is still an imperfect world of knowledge, because we know that of these 140,000 chemicals, many of them simply exist. Many, and an increasing number, is being used, and many are also entering into cycles that we may not have envisaged, or that we did not anticipate, or that we simply do not know about.
We are now much more than we may think living in a world of chemicals. Another point to illustrate what we call the chemical intensification, if you wish, of the economy is the fact that it's spreading in the daily life. Chemicals are not just used for discrete issues here and there. They are completely spread over in daily life through the penetration of chemical intensive products in, I would say, in the average product that we're using. We are now looking more and more at studies that document the high level of POPs, persistent organic pollutants, including in aquatic mammals, polar bears, fish-eating birds. So it's going up into the food chain. And there is evidence as well that these contaminants are responsible for the near extinction of some species over the world. This is not without economic costs, obviously. And there are very interesting evidence that unsound management of chemical bear very high cost. Just one example that I think you'll find in this report as well. If you look at the estimated cost of poisoning from pesticide in sub-Saharan Africa, only the injury and the loss of working time, I'm not talking about projection of future revenues or, really only that, is estimated to be 6.3 billion US dollars in 2009. This is higher than the total ODA that is going to the health sector in the same area.
And this is 17 years after Theo Colburn's book, Our Stolen Future, and it will be 14 years after the EU EDC strategy was first published. So during all this time, the exposure continues and the scientific concerns have been rising.
One of the most important lessons that we've learned is that children are uniquely susceptible to the toxic chemicals and other factors in the environment.
For a number of reasons, infants and youngsters up to age 4 have much higher levels of many problem chemicals in their bodies than adults do. And scientists have begun to pin down the causes.
First of all, children have greater exposure pound for pound than adults. They eat more food, they drink more water, they breathe more air per pound of body weight. So they take into their body more of any toxic chemicals that are in food, air, and water. And then on top of that, kids' exposure is further magnified because they live on the floor, they crawl around a few inches above the rug, they're constantly putting their hands, their toys, their lollipops in their mouths, and so all of those factors increase their exposure. They're biologically more vulnerable than we adults. Their nervous system, their reproductive organs, their immune system, their lungs, all the organs in their body are undergoing very, very rapid growth and development. And those developmental processes are very fragile, they're very easily upset, and unfortunately, if development is perturbed at a vulnerable early stage by some chemical like lead or pesticides or PCB, the damage in many cases is irreparable. It can't be cured, it can't be treated, it results in lifelong impairment.
So this was on time a number of years ago, and we're concerned about development being a time in life where there is disruption of the genetic control systems that can lead to disease much later in life. So it's the developmental origin of health and disease, and the primary focus has been on drugs, stress, nutrition, infections, and only recently has there been also a fair amount of information coming out about environmental chemicals exerting these changes. And it's very clear, a bad start in life, you have a totally different type of life. And what we're finding out is an event called epigenetics is what turns out to be, in all likelihood, the mechanism by which these chemicals are able to cause this harm. So epigenetics essentially refers to any change in DNA that is not a classical mutation, all right? So when I was in school, this is what I was taught. And this is what I now teach in my reproductive endocrinology class, that it isn't just the genes you have, which certainly matter, but it's whether the control systems that turn those genes on and off are programmed right. And it's hormones that do that.
We were struck by the fact that rates of a whole series of chronic diseases are rising in American children.
We see increases in so many diseases that are preventable.
Asthma has tripled over the past 20 years. Obesity has tripled. Childhood cancer has risen by 40%. Certain birth defects have doubled. Autism has increased to alarming rates.
We all care about the next generation. That's our future.
Parents are often overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information about environmental threats to children's health. It is possible, it is definitely possible for parents to take action to protect their children against many of the most serious environmental threats to health. All parents need is knowledge. It's our job, it's our mission to give them that knowledge.
We have changed people's minds, and
influence policy. We want our children and our children's children to be as healthy and productive as possible.
The Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists admits few, if any, babies are likely to come to real harm if they're exposed to the chemicals found in everything from food wrapping to cosmetics and cars. Nonetheless, it suggests women should play it safe and err on the side of caution.
The document does not outline things that women should avoid during pregnancy. What the document outlines is the fact that for a while we have been concerned about certain chemicals that may be present in our environment. We do not know what the risks are, but we wish to make women more aware of this, giving them the information that they might find helpful so that they can make decisions to change their lifestyle. The problem with determining effects of any chemical exposure, especially mixtures of different chemicals, means that it's a long time. It'll be a long time before we would even know if there are any risks. What we hope to do with this document is have a proactive approach so that we could give women the information and so they can make informed choices.
Its report gives a list of things women could avoid or cut back on. These include food and drink in cans and plastic containers, like ready meals, cosmetics and toiletries such as moisturisers, shower gel and fragrances. Pregnant women could also avoid buying new furniture, fabrics, non-stick frying pans and cars. But many experts have criticised the advice for being alarmist. The Royal College of Midwives said pregnant women should take the advice with caution and use their common sense and judgment.
All around us are the products of modern chemistry. Window shades, draperies, upholstery, and furniture. All are made of or covered with something that came out of a test tube. Radio cabinets, tabletops, and hundreds of other useful articles are made of new plastics created in the chemist's laboratory.
A hormone is an organic molecule secreted by an endocrine gland in response to a physiological signal or signals, which are carried through the blood to a target tissue where it intervenes to produce a biological response. Hormones are chemically categorized into several classes, proteins of which a primary example can be growth hormone or prolactin. Peptides, which are small building blocks of proteins. Good examples of a peptide hormone are insulin, oxytocin, or parathyroid hormone. A third category is amino acid-derived hormones. These include thyroxine from the thyroid gland or epinephrine from the adrenals. And a fourth category is fatty acid-derived hormones. A major example are prostaglandins. Finally, the last class of hormones is steroids. Good examples of steroids are estradiol and testosterone, the sex steroids, and as well the glucocorticoids.
Importantly, these chemicals aren't only found in factories or behind laboratory doors, as they are all around us in our environment and everyday products. You can find EDCs in many toiletries, detergents, plastic containers, and many other sources.
Those most threatened by toxic chemicals are not adults. They are children and babies. But the most vulnerable of all have not even been born.
The early development of the embryo
is identical for men and women, okay? The sexual differences begin to develop later, and it's really because if there's a Y chromosome that comes from the man, that causes the embryo to develop testes. And testes cause the result in the secretion of testosterone. And therefore that modifies the developing embryo to develop as a male. Because the Y chromosome is the male chromosome. So all you ladies have XX chromosomes. We poor males have X and Y. And the Y chromosome makes the embryo masculine by causing a testis to develop. There are other genes too, I'm not going to take you through, but the main thing is that the testis leads to the secretion of testosterone, which modifies the embryo to develop as a male.
There is no question that the most serious effects are to the unborn child, because the effects are permanent and because the fetus has very few defenses against these chemicals.
This is a time when all the cells are starting to divide from each other, developing into organs. And this can start as early as 6 weeks, even earlier, after conception.
Until recently, doctors believed that the fetus was protected from contamination by the placental barrier. But the womb provides no such protection.
Everything that the mother is exposed to could potentially expose the fetus. The difference is that the fetus is exquisitely sensitive, many, many more times more sensitive than the mother, and so it's much more dangerous.
These test tubes contain umbilical cord blood. We've analyzed thousands of them and found pollutants such as heavy metals, organochlorine pesticides, PCBs, and that means that the mother was exposed to these pollutants and transmitted them through her bloodstream to her unborn child.
Progress is merciless. After Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, we now have Homo toxicus.
After birth, the infant is further exposed to chemicals in the mother's breast milk.
There's no question that when you show that mother's milk has contaminants, and then you actually look at babies, and you can actually take a blood sample or a urine sample and show that those contaminants are not only in that child, but they stay in that child.
Genetics plays a potentially very important role in determining the effects of early life exposures on children's health and development. So, for example, we're looking at the effects of environmental exposures, physical toxicants in the environment, common everyday pollutants that we experience, particularly in urban areas, air pollutants, bisphenol A, phthalates, pesticides, at the low levels to which we're generally exposed. So and we have observed some relationships between fetal exposures, prenatal exposures, and health effects in children following a cohort of children for a number of years from in utero forward into childhood and even adolescence. So we look upon epigenetics as a potentially very important mechanism in mediating those effects and in helping us to link exposures to the clinical outcomes that we're measuring. And in doing so, elucidate the mechanisms by which this damage is incurring, which we hope very much will be useful in prevention, in designing effective interventions, and also in monitoring the efficacy of those interventions. We're specifically hypothesizing that prenatal exposure to environmental contaminants, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from fossil fuel burning, other combustion sources, secondhand tobacco smoke, pesticides used for control of indoor pests in urban areas, and what are called endocrine disrupting chemicals, bisphenol A and phthalates, that they are having an effect when the fetus is exposed through the mother's environmental exposure, that they are having an effect on children's neurodevelopment, neurobehavior particularly, on asthma risk, and obesity and metabolic disorders, and further, that they may be increasing the risk of intermediate damage associated with cancer. So we further theorize that in addition to genotoxic pathways that can be important for some of these chemical exposures, pollutant exposures, that epigenetics may be involved. And we're studying that both within our cohorts of mothers and newborns who are enrolled during the pregnancy period and then followed for many years into adolescence. Our oldest children are now approaching the age of 12 and 13. We theorize that we will be able to draw better links between those early exposures and the outcomes by understanding and measuring the epigenetic changes, both that we determine in the cord blood at birth, looking also at placental tissue, and then further following and analyzing the samples from those children at older ages. So we further theorize that the prenatal period will be a window of exquisite susceptibility to these exposures. So those are our hypotheses. We're not leaving out, however, the broader context, the social context in which individuals are living, to which they're reacting on a daily basis. So we are looking at psychosocial stressors, also genetic susceptibility, because we think there's an important interaction between genetic susceptibility and other environmental factors, and nutritional factors. So our studies are attempting to capture those things as best we can and to look at the relationships among them. I think that through more understanding of the pathways that are involved in the effects that are observed in relation to early life exposures, prenatal and early postnatal exposures, that through that understanding we can craft really effective and targeted interventions. Those will include behavioral interventions, educational programs, for example, nutritional interventions, and people are talking about pharmacological interventions as well. My area, focusing on preventable environmental exposures, in my area, we tend to think of policy changes that can dramatically affect the environment of a population, and actually dealing especially with involuntary exposures that are problematic, such as, for example, air pollution. So we think in terms of how scientific data can inform policies, regulatory and other kinds of policies to address those environmental threats. I mentioned our exploring, really, the word is exploring, the interactions between the environmental exposures, the physical toxicants that we're interested in, and the other factors, genetic susceptibility, nutritional susceptibility, psychosocial stressors, all of which can worsen, exacerbate the effect of the physical toxicants. Those studies, because our cohorts are fairly limited in size, we enrolled about 740 women in pregnancy and are following them and their children. Those are fairly limited. We consider them to be exploratory, but that it's important to attempt to assess those at this point, and then hopefully we'll be able to do larger studies in the future.
I think we're only just beginning to realize how important that cocktail effect is. It's extremely difficult to study. It's expensive, time-consuming. But what the animal studies, very carefully conducted animal studies, have shown is that when you take these chemicals at levels at which individual chemicals have no effect, then together they can have big effects. And again, the effects that we're talking about that have been studied so far are on male reproductive development, so they will include this time window of vulnerability. And the implications of that are enormous, because it means that when you look at one chemical that we may be exposed to low levels of, and which is, you may think this will have no effect, you can't look at it like that. You must say, what else are you exposed to, and how will those add up?
So you move in a what we call dose additive way from no effect on each of the chemicals to combining them and having a very large effect. So I think it's something that everyone is familiar with. If you go to the doctor, your doctor says, what else are you taking before I prescribe this, right? But we don't do that with the chemicals.
There's always been a mythology about pregnancy, but now actually some of that mythology is turning out to be rather more true than we expected.
We're starting to realize that the months we spend in the womb are some of the most important of our lives.
So what happens in the womb can last a lifetime.
We're just beginning to understand that chemistry. That chemistry operates in the range of parts per trillion and parts per billion, which industry has told us for years it's harmless. Concentrations like that are unimportant. But when you interrupt a vital system, something that's developing where these eggs are splitting and developing and budding and forming legs and arms and duct systems and glands, at a part per trillion, these are very dangerous chemicals.
Fred Vomsal of the University of Missouri and Don Tillett of the U.S. Geological Survey live and work in the nation's heartland. Alarmed by rising numbers of wild animals found with bizarre developmental and reproductive problems, they've joined a national effort to find the cause. The prime suspects include pesticides, the residue of birth control pills and other drugs in treated wastewater, and a compound found in many familiar plastics, bisphenol A.
The problem with chemicals such as bisphenol A is it breaks out of the plastic and leaches into water.
Studies show that from water, this chemical can get into animals. And there it can act like a dose of the female sex hormone estrogen. Too much estrogen can disrupt the endocrine system, and that's been linked to a wide range of health impacts, including gender bending. One critical unanswered question is at what level of exposure these effects occur. With bisphenol A, we're talking about extremely small quantities of this chemical getting into the environment. Samples drawn from this stream had only 30 parts per trillion. Vomsal is worried because studies show tiny amounts of bisphenol A can derail early cell development in mice. And if mice are vulnerable, might people be as well? Recently, Vomsal tested clear plastic baby bottles to see if they release bisphenol A. He devised the simplest of experiments. Let distilled water sit in brand new bottles for 24 hours and then test it. every one released bisphenol A. Curious, he then decided to see what happens when the same baby bottles are run through an ordinary dishwasher, which heats them to 140 degrees.
Some of these bottles, by the time we had washed them 10 times, were leaching 10 times more bisphenol A than they had before they had been washed.
The plastics industry vigorously disputes any danger to children from the chemical. They cite the continued blessing of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration.
Bisphenol A, or BPA, is a chemical that is much discussed these days. BPA is the essential ingredient used to manufacture both polycarbonate plastics and epoxy resins. Polycarbonate is a transparent plastic providing solidity, lightweight, and shatter resistance to a wide variety of products, from solar panels to mobile phone casings, from safety helmets to car bumpers or to DVDs, to name just a few of its many applications. Epoxy resins are mostly used as coatings. They provide excellent anti-corrosions and antibacterial protection, as well as elasticity and versatility. Applications using epoxies range from sports equipment to car parts, from tin cans to construction panels, from wind turbine blades to tankers or home appliances. You name it. But what about the BPA that is bonded in these materials? Is it safe? Scientists from academia, government, and industry have been studying BPA extensively over the years. In fact, no other chemical has undergone such a wide range of testing. Research shows that we absorb very low levels of BPA when drinking or eating from material made using BPA. Our body is very effective at quickly transforming these very low BPA residues into an inactive kind of sugar, which we excrete via the urine rapidly. But recently, controversy has emerged among scientists about the possibility that BPA may have harmful effects on humans. Some scientists claim that BPA causes or contributes to cause a series of diseases, while others confirm that, as it is used safely, bisphenol A has no harmful effects on humans. So what are the facts? Is there cause for concern? Like other chemicals, be they natural or man-made, BPA can weakly act like an estrogen, the primary female sex hormone. Does this intake of external estrogen cause any damage to our hormonal system? Many things we eat each day trigger hormonal changes in our bodies, with no adverse effect. For example, carrots and soybeans contain natural hormone-like chemical components. The levels at which we are exposed to BPA do not raise concerns for any damage to our hormonal systems. And many of these estrogen-like compounds are far more active than BPA. In fact, one person would have to eat 600 kilos of food in contact with BPA-based polycarbonate utensils to ingest the same amount of estrogen-like compounds that he would absorb from eating 150 grams plate of carrots. BPA has been found in urine and blood samples of people affected with diseases such as cancer, obesity, or diabetes. There are many different risk factors for these diseases, and often they're associated with lifestyle and behaviors. Physical inactivity, unhealthy diets, drinking, and smoking are all identified risk factors. The mere presence of BPA in blood and urine samples does not mean it causes cancer, obesity, or diabetes. For example, people drinking beverages from cans coated with epoxy resins will display some BPA in their urine. But to reach a level at which BPA would become harmful, a 60 kilos person would have to drink more than 1,800 cans a day. So, for BPA, as for any other chemical, Let's look at the facts, investigate examples, and use our best judgment before jumping to any hasty conclusion as regards the safety of a product which plays a key role in food and sanitary protection. From recreation to food, from convenience to shelter, BPA brings many benefits to our daily lives. And while we may have questions on its effects, research and experience show that BPA is safe.
It's not lost on some of you that that is special interest blabber. We heard that from the American Tobacco Institute for years. Remember? 3 studies are equivocal about whether smoking causes cancer.
The record shows that many of the country's most respected doctors openly challenged anti-cigarette claims. A California doctor said, as a scientist, I find no persuasive evidence that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. A New York doctor told Congress to claim there is now sufficient scientific evidence to establish that cigarette smoking causes disease is, in my opinion, unjustified. There is another side to the cigarette controversy. It's all here in this white paper. Send for it.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor?
Tens of thousands of doctors in all branches of medicine, in all parts of the country, were asked that question. The brand named most was Camel.
Smoke Camels, the cigarette so many doctors enjoy.
This new insect destroyer contains a lot of DDT. Its DDT content is even higher than government specifications. Ideal for vertical surfaces, on fruit and vegetable stands, in cupboards, and it's perfect for ridding Fido of those unwelcome house guests.
This contemporary home shows how modern asbestos materials can be adapted to any style or design. Notice how the asbestos cement sidewalls help add dignity and charm.
Oh, it is attractive.
Yes, and it'll stay that way, too. That's what I like about it.
And they correctly said, and still to this day, we do not know biophysically the precise links between smoking and cancer. So they give you a therefore when there's no therefore there. Therefore, it's premature to act. That's a personal value judgment or risk management. Of course, they protect market share. Whereas the data are so overwhelming epidemiologically, the statistics, that you'd have to be crazy not to control this, even though you don't understand every detail of the mechanisms. How many people in this place, in this fire-prone California, have had a house fire? A few of you. Typically, it's 1% to 2%. How many of you have fire insurance? We already are very risk-averse when we have consequences that matter. We do not need 95% certainty. Supposing you got a spot on your lung from a chest x-ray, which you did for a different purpose than looking for cancer. Well, it could be a healed lesion or it could be the beginning of a tumor. So they were asked what to do. Well, what should we do, Doc? Well, do a biopsy. Well, it's hard to get to. We have to do surgery. Surgery has a risk. It's expensive. It's painful. In other words, there's a price for a false positive. If you believe that that could be cancer and you try to take it out, you will pay a price. So, okay, we don't want to pay the price, so let's wait and see. What can we do? And the doc said, well, you can wait, and if it grows, then we better take it out. And of course, this patient said, but what's the chance that if I wait and it grows, that it becomes metastatic, and therefore it'll be too late and I'll be dead, whereas if I take it out now in a precautionary mode, pay the price for the surgery I might not need, I'll have a lower likelihood of being dead. Now, what's the right answer to that? There is no right answer. That's your value judgment. It means that you're leaving it up to the public and the political world to figure that out for themselves. They're capable of it, but they rarely do it.
Breast Cancer UK is taking a stand on the high levels of these dangerous chemicals in our environment. Currently, we are leading a focused campaign against a pervasive EDC called bisphenol A, which is found in many plastics. Due to the cancer risk, Canada has already classified bisphenol A as a toxin, and, along with the US, they are drawing up new laws to phase it out of babies' products. But the UK government has not acknowledged these dangers, as they argue that there is not yet enough conclusive evidence on how bisphenol A affects people. This may appear reasonable, but scientists have so far been unable to carry out a conclusive human trial, With no time for delay, we need to consult the evidence that is available. There have been many persuasive studies on laboratory rats and mice. They consistently demonstrated that exposure to bisphenol A in the womb and around the time of birth leads to alterations in mammary tissue, which can go on to develop into tumours. Importantly, the subjects were given environmentally relevant amounts of bisphenol A, low concentrations of the chemical, just as any person would encounter in everyday life. Studies have also been carried out on cultures of human breast cancer cells. They demonstrated that bisphenol A can activate estrogen receptors and encourage the multiplication of cancer cells. Further studies have shown that exposure to bisphenol A is also very common. The chemical is present in plastic food containers, food can linings and babies' products, and it has been proven that bisphenol A can leach into what we all eat and drink. 38 of the world's leading scientific experts on bisphenol A have considered all this evidence and warned policymakers about the potentially harmful effects of exposure to the chemical. The evidence shows us that something has to be done.
The Japanese are cutting back in their use of bisphenol A, and recent independent studies have motivated the FDA to take a fresh look.
just the genes, but also the environment in the early life of your ancestors. It's not so much you are what you eat, it's that you are what your mother ate, and maybe you are what your grandmother ate. And if you take our data, you are what stress your grandmother or grandfather had.
It takes a lot of resources, a lot of attention, and a lot of awareness of the problems for people to make a difference.
This is really a social and political problem, and we need, if any chemical is toxic and known to accumulate in umbilical cord, blood, or mother's milk, it really has no place in our economy.
As consumers become more aware of the need for safer materials, companies that offer non-toxic products are benefiting financially. Safer materials are helping to enhance the bottom line in sectors as diverse as clothing, food, and cosmetics. Fortunately, action is being taken to bring safer chemicals to the market, in legislative chambers around the world, in the laboratory, and in the business community. For instance, Europe banned 1,100 chemicals linked to cancer and birth defects from cosmetics, and is requiring chemical companies to safety test their chemicals in an initiative known as REACH. In the U.S., some companies are following the lead of Europe and eliminating chemicals banned in the EU from products sold in the U.S., even though they're not required to do so under U.S. law. In fact, hundreds of companies have signed the Compact for Safe Cosmetics to provide at least the same protection in the U.S. as in Europe. And then there are some promising new developments in laboratories. Green chemistry.
Why not come up with alternatives to mercury? Why not come up with alternatives to the hazards? To design at the molecular level, just as an architect designs a building, we can design molecules to do what we want them to do. We don't have to have toxic materials. Green chemistry is the science of how to make materials that society depends on in an environmentally responsible way. That's basically what it is how do you make a molecule and have that molecule do all the things you want it to do and not hurt the environment.
I would say, quite frankly, we should be more worried about these health effects. They are going to be more imminent in terms of human society and humankind and all living organisms on Earth than the threat of climate change. It's going to get us sooner.
Every generation before our generation was not living as long as we are living and not as healthy as us. And now what we are seeing is the younger generation with tremendously higher incidence of cancer, of obesity, of diabetes, of neurologic disorders, of brain and behavioral abnormalities, of immune disorders. All of these are caused by environmental endocrine disruptors. And the incidence of all of these diseases in our children are much higher than in my generation.
Well, with what I know today about the extensive misuse of chemistry on a global scale, I cannot conjure up good dreams for the future. I have only bad dreams. Yet I want the world to be cleaner and to be kinder to each child that is born. I often wonder what makes me keep digging. I'm going to cry with it. But I also realize that in the process of dehumanizing mankind with man-made chemicals, we are also producing individuals who will never understand the need to protect what is natural, to protect our life support systems. Individuals who will never see the beauty and the mystery in the birth of a new baby or the bursting forth of foliage in a food crop in the springtime. Despite these dire thoughts, more and more, though, I see parents who are concerned about their health and the health of their children. And women especially are trying desperately to find out what is safe and what will not harm the babies they are carrying in their wombs and their children already there in their homes.
There is also hope that deep within everyone, there is something bigger and stronger than we are aware of at this time that cannot be suppressed by man-made chemicals. Something that will prompt some very exceptional leadership to step forward with the courage to turn off corporate control of the government and the world and take back for society what it needs to thrive.